Guten Tag, today I want to test and show you whether it's worth going through the trouble of making a sourdough bread or not. We will be making a yeast-based dough, a mild sourdough bread, and then lastly, a very sour and tangy sourdough bread. Seriously, it's so sour that it hits you in the face. Now with the yeast-based dough, it's so easy. You just open up a package of dry yeast, toss a little bit into your dough, and you're mostly done. With the sourdough, you're almost adopting a pet. You have to take care of that pet all the time. You have to feed it continuously. I love making sourdough bread, but don't get me wrong, it really can be a hassle. So yeah, is it really worth it going through all the trouble? Let's find out in this experiment. We are getting started by making the 3 doughs together at the same time. For that, I'm just using bread flour, a little bit of whole wheat flour, water and salt. No yeast or starter is added yet. Bakers have a fancy word for this. Autolysis. Sorry for my German pronunciation. And if you're making a yeast-based dough, then this really is a game changer. With the sourdough bread, not so much, because sourdoughs in general take a lot longer to be ready. A yeast-based dough is typically ready within an hour or so. Just by waiting a little bit, we're leaving that mixture for 2 hours at room temperature. You will get a much more fluffy bread in the end and have better browning during the baking process. More on that in a bit. So that mixture is set for around 2 hours at room temperature. Then afterwards, I divided that. For the sourdough-based dough, I'm using 2 different starters. Side note, if you have no idea how to make a sourdough starter, please check out this video. It's a full guide showing you exactly how to make the perfect starter. For the first dough, I'm using a liquid sourdough starter. Liquid because it's mostly liquidishy. And the more water your sourdough starter has in general, the more tang, the more sourness you're going to inflict in your main dough. So if you're a chaser of that sour taste, then this could be something for you. For the next dough, I'm using my stiff starter. Actually, I think a better name would be dry starter. The liquid starter has 5 times as much water as flour. The stiff starter has half the water of the flour. And the stiff starter is gonna make you a more mild bread in the end. It focuses the yeast part of your sourdough dough. The tang is mostly coming from the bacteria. For the liquid starter, I'm using around 20 grams of this liquid starter. For the dry starter, I'm using 40 grams of this dry starter. And now please brace yourself, because next up, the yeast-based dough. And this is something that I really want you to learn from this video. Each of the doughs has around 400 grams of flour. And for the yeast-based dough, I'm only using half a gram of dry yeast. You could also be using 1.5 grams of fresh yeast. It's really just a very tiny amount. And this will give us a very slow fermentation process. And that's exactly what you want. That's the secret to making perfect yeast-based doughs. I can't wait to test all of them next to each other. The flavor of all 3 of them is gonna be quite unique. So I kneaded all of the doughs, and I've also now extracted all of the different dough samples. With the stiff starter, I'm gonna be aiming for a doubling in size. With the liquid starter, I have to be a little bit careful, so I'm gonna be double checking the dough here at the middle mark, because the lactic acid is more active. This means your gluten network is broken down faster. Your dough can over-ferment much quicker, so be careful. I've not baked a bread like this with this flour yet, so that's why I gotta be extra careful. And with the yeast, I'm also aiming for a doubling in size. Also with the stiff starter, I could probably go further, but I wanna be on the safe side today. At around 50% size increase, I'm giving all of them 1 stretch and fold. With the wetted hands, I'm carefully removing the dough from the edges of the container. And wow, this dough just held together so well. It really didn't expand so much in size, which is a sign of good dough strength development. I'm just sprinkling the dough with a little bit of flour. And then I'm flipping it over. Turning this into a little bit of a rectangle. And I'm just amazed at what this stiff starter is doing. Look at how puffy this dough is. To me, this is the perfect dough. From the consistency, how it feels right now, this is really good. Great, I'm going to be leaving this for 15 minutes at room temperature and then it's going to go into the fridge overnight. So 15 minutes again at room temperature and then into the fridge overnight. Good night, my doughs. They're gonna sit in the fridge overnight and then tomorrow morning we will directly bake them without letting them come to room temperature first. Good night. Gluten morgen. Ha ha ha. I hope you see what I did there. So I'm preparing the oven. This is how we will bake everything. I have a large bowl here at the bottom. It's able to withstand high heat. That's important because it's gonna heat up and then we will be pouring in some boiling water for a lot of steam. Something made out of steel, out of a cast iron would also work. Don't use glass, it's gonna shatter. Then I have a stone here. You wouldn't need to have a stone. You could also be using another tray here. This stone is going to be able to give a little bit more energy to the dough, so you might get a little bit more oven spring. And then I have another tray here on top, and this is important because we will have indirect heat here. The heating elements won't be directly on top, and this means that all the steam that comes from the bottom is gonna stay below here, and it's gonna give us a very, very nice environment, perfect for baking bread. This way we will have more oven spring as the crust forms a little bit later. Or you could just be using a Dutch oven, of course. But nope, today this is how we're gonna bake because everybody can do this at home. Disadvantage of the stone, it takes quite a lot of time for it to be ready. So I'm preheating it for around 30 minutes. I'm using max temperature and then I'm reducing everything to 230 degrees Celsius. All of the doughs look really nice. Stiff starter, so fluffy. Liquid starter, and here the yeast-based option. Let's bake them and then I'm very excited to test the taste. And also, what about oven spring? I like to sprinkle a little bit of semolina flour. This helps to make the dough a little bit non-stick. I don't want this to stick to the stone now. You could also be using a parchment paper if you wanted to, but I like this approach. I'm gonna try to bake all of them at the same time. Let's see how that's gonna go. And baking has been completed, and check this out. We have the stiff starter one. Look at that massive oven spring, nice ear here. The liquid starter one, and you can see here it was a bad idea to bake 3 of them at the same time on the stone. The problem here, I think, is it wasn't inflated enough. It should have fermented a little bit more. That's why we didn't get so much oven spring. Furthermore, it was also a little bit more watery because I had to use more water. So maybe it was also a little bit too much water. I would need to try again with the same flour, definitely. And then lastly, the yeast-based version. And look at this here. Shows one more time that I should have only baked 1 or 2 maximum at the same time. What kind of happened here is the dough went into this direction rather than giving me this oven spring here. So lesson learned, let's slice them open and compare the different crumbs. Crumb time! And I like to check the crumb because this really shows you how you fermented and whether your bread was a success or not. Let's start with the yeast-based crumb. Very, very airy. Check out those tiny pockets here. That's a sign that the fermentation really went perfectly. Excuse this failure, please. Liquid starter one. Wow, looks really nice, right? You see how airy this is here? I think that might have been the increased extensibility by adding more water, and also the lactic acid bacteria digesting your gluten network a little bit. Your gluten network is going to get softer and softer over time. Good looking crumb. And now last but not least, this starter one, and just check out this crumb. It's so airy, it's so soft. To me, this really is the perfect crumb structure that you want. Looking really, really nice. And now let's taste them and see if we can taste the difference. This is so fluffy. And check out the crust and this ear here. This is the perfect sourdough bread. One more time, the yeast-based version, liquid starter, and the stiff starter. I'm gonna start with eating the yeast-based one first. What an excellent taste. Seriously, the consistency is great, very good, but the taste is also rather neutral. No acidity, but still the crust and the fermentation. This is really a great yeast-based bread. Now, oh no, I'm gonna start with the stiff starter-based one. And one more time here, just in comparison, just see how much more inflated this one is. Consistency is perfect. It's very mild, but then in the end, you get hit by that slight tang, which this bread doesn't have. Great bread. And now the liquid starter one. I expect this to be so much more sour. Oh wow. The flavor this bread has, wow. Oh, this is so good. The taste is just so much more complex. You have those slight dairy notes, the acidity. This really is a great sourdough if you want to have standalone sourdough bread. If you wanted to have a side, this as a side for a soup, for instance, I would go for this one. But from just a sheer flavor explosion in your mouth, this one is just so good. Verdict time. All of the three doughs were quite good. The mild dough and the yeast-based dough were quite similar in terms of taste. The mild one just had a little bit of that slight tang. I took all the three breads and met some friends, and they also couldn't taste such a major difference. But what really surprised them was the dough made with a liquid starter. Seriously, that tang. You took a bite and you could feel all the water in your mouth being soaked up by that bread. It's just such a flavor explosion in your mouth. But I guess sometimes you want to have a more plain taste. That's when I would probably opt for that mild sourdough, the stiffer starter, or the yeast-based dough. Before you bounce, you get a chance to win a really cool shirt like this. All you gotta do for that is head to the comment section and write a comment and tell me which of the doughs I should be making for my own bakery. Which of the doughs would you be buying? Thank you so much, hope you learned something new, and as always, may the gluten be with you.